So I'm Molly Fadul, for those of you that weren't here last night. I have a background in real estate private equity. I started to get involved in the real estate tech space in about 2015. Before that, I was exclusively focused on investing in opportunistic real estate all over the world. Did a lot of work in Latin America, and I've invested in all asset classes, basically, besides senior housing, in the US. And in 2015, kind of saw some trends changing in real estate. And with all the changes we've seen in technology, saw companies starting to come out with more innovative ideas of how to own, operate, buy, build, develop real estate. And so became interested in that and started investing in companies. Since then, I've invested in numerous real estate technology companies, and I help advise them and serve on the board of some of them. And so that's a little bit about my background. What we'd like to do is go down the line here and have everyone give a little bit of background on themselves, and then we'll go into some questions that I'll ask, and then we can open it up for you all so we can talk about whatever it is that you guys are interested in today.
Thank you. So I'm Sam DeBoard with Real Estate Standards Organization. I obviously got the memo on the dress code, so dress down for you today. I really enjoyed Mark's presentation and some of your questions, because what we do is basically technical standards for the traditional organized real estate industry. So multiple listing services, brokerages, agents, and then technology companies that work with consumers as well. So data definitions, data transport, access to data, whether that's common structures or basically just systems that we can make sure that the tools work across the industry for consumers and professionals as well. So background in technology consulting, and then doing MLS and data management and policy work for the National Association of Realtors. And now we're tackling some of those very big hurdles we need to in the organized real estate world for having common data standards.
My name is Drew Meyers. I've been writing about real estate tech for probably 12 years now, I think, long time. And I think the three areas that I spend most of my time on are, I do a lot of strategic writing in the industry around trends and kind of interesting companies that are coming on the scene. And then I do a lot of community building, so I run what I describe as a think tank for real estate tech, and actually 2 members are here. There's 170 members around the globe. And then I do some product development and product strategy for startups and kind of brokers, and oftentimes brokerages who have ideas and no idea how to turn ideas into technical products. So.
I'm Simon Stevenson. I'm a professor at UW. I joined UW nearly 3 years ago now. From the UK originally, so I spent a lot of time though sort of in Ireland. My sort of background is, and I suppose maybe where I'm sort of here for, is my background is sort of straddles both finance and real estate. And to some degree as well on the data standards, just purely from a personal perspective, from a research viewpoint, sort of, how technology is sort of changing how we look at data and how we sort of how it can be used in that context as well.
Great. So I think we'd like to start out just kind of talking a little bit about the biggest trends and the trends that you think will change real estate sooner rather than later. Obviously, there's a lot of work going on in various aspects, and real estate technology is a huge world. Drew, do you want to talk a little bit about fintech and real estate tech and how those are overlapping?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest trends that I guess I call it certainty as a service. And certainty as a service encompasses a lot of different things, but the financial side of it is a big component to the iBuying movement that's starting to pop up with Zillow and Redfin and Opendoor and OfferPad and all these companies around the country kind of buying houses with direct cash much quicker and providing more certainty to the sellers in the process. And I think that convergence of fintech and real estate is starting to happen it's starting to be unbundled. I mean, iBuyers are kind of doing the whole thing, right? Like they'll buy the house, sell the house, flip the house, everything. But I think we'll start to see brokerages actually not do the whole thing necessarily, but do pockets of that, like provide certainty in home warranties or provide certainty on like buyers becoming cash buyers, which like Fly Homes is a brokerage here in Seattle that's turning their clients into cash buyers. Ribbon is kind of a platform that's helping other brokerages around the country kind of offer that same fintech solution to their client base. So that's one of the biggest trends, I think. I mean, there's other topics we could go into too, but certainty as a service is certainly like probably the broadest trend that's being kind of unbundled and rebundled.
Yeah, for sure. And I think fintech and real estate tech are also converging when you think about blockchain and the ownership of real estate by digital means. You have numerous exchanges throughout the world working to build exchanges that are blockchain based. And at some point, many people believe that all assets in the world, stocks, bonds, art, maybe cars and boats, real estate may trade in a digital means. So there's a huge movement in that space to figure out how do we use the blockchain to track ownership and real estate transactions. And there's a lot of companies working in that space. Moving on, I guess, from fintech, maybe we can talk a little bit about data. And Sam, you guys have a big job in terms of standardizing data. Could you talk a little bit about how you're using technology to do that and realistic timeframes on how long it might take this laggard industry, I guess, from a tech perspective, to really catch up to the way that some fintech companies and other industries are able to evolve quickly with technology? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just for a little bit of background, if you haven't worked with the residential real estate data from the traditional brokerages and MLSs, when we started, everybody built their own technology and their own proprietary systems in each marketplace. So you had over 1,000 multiple listing services, and they had their own definitions of their data and metadata and different transport systems. And one tech vendor was requiring you to FTP to get their data. They moved on to a traditional protocol that was proprietary again to the industry called RETS about 20 years ago, and we're trying to move everybody over to modern web-based RESTful APIs to move data, what any modern technology person would understand and know immediately, and that's how you bring innovation into the industry, is have more technology folks in the space. So as you know, when things work, people don't want to move their infrastructure. They don't want to change the systems they have in place. So you have silos throughout the industry where you've got data in this market that doesn't match up to data in this market. You've got a technology company in New York who's serving a broker in Seattle who has a client in California. And from a simple perspective, a room that's a bonus room in California and is a great room in Seattle and is a frog in the Southeast because they call it finished room over garage, it's the same room. And it should have the same metadata, or at least a system where we can match those up so that those apps work nationwide. Well, consumers a lot of times have better apps than brokers and agents do right now, because they're using these systems that are siloed in each of these marketplaces. So as we move them onto a common data dictionary, which is ever expanding, not just about property data, but about your clients, about their saved searches, about the usage of your tools, you can kind of start to see ROI there. You can start to port your clients and those saved searches across different tools. You just have much more interoperability between your tools, and the brokerage and the MLSs are starting to get there. We still have about 600 MLSs across the country, all with their own rules, all with their own systems. So there's a continuing movement, and it's growing in momentum. But when folks from other technology areas come into the real estate industry, a lot of times they say, okay, now I can just get the data and I can do this, that, and the other. And it's a little messier than that when you see what the data actually looks like and the ways you can access it. So we are growing pretty quickly in terms of membership groups. Zillow Group, I think, provided your data for this event. Any of the big technology vendors in the industry are members of RESO, and so they're supportive of the standards movement. Will I have a time frame for you? That's a difficult one. But it's moving faster and faster. We have half the number of MLSs today as we did about 5 or 6 years ago. And probably 3/4 of them are now giving access to data via the data dictionary and via a RESTful API. So we're getting there. There's a lot of parts moving all at once, and getting folks to move their infrastructure while, to give you a real boots on the ground example, if you run an MLS and you change one button on the listing input, you're going to have 10,000 type A personalities calling you saying, who moved my cheese? What's happening here? That's how difficult it is to have a big overhaul in your technology.
I think on the residential side, that's definitely the case. On the commercial side, I think it's almost even a little bit more challenging. Obviously, you have various data providers that you can buy data from, but a lot of people are very careful about protecting their data, so they're not necessarily willing to sell it. So sometimes the data that you're buying off of the large providers is actually not good data. And another thing that I think is interesting, and I'm not sure that a lot of people outside of the industry really recognize this, but some of the largest owners of real estate in the world track their ownership data in very old or systems or just Excel based. And so it's going to be a significant time period and going to take some innovation in terms of tools of pulling companies' data, their own data that they own today that they have and they're not using. And so I think there's steps in different aspects of our industry, but the commercial real estate industry really needs to get a hold of their own data first inside their companies and understand how to use it and apply business intelligence to it. And there is a movement, and a lot of companies are getting much better at this, but there are many owners of institutional real estate throughout the world that don't necessarily have a good grasp on what data they do have and when leases are expiring. There's many SaaS companies that are signing new clients up every day that will just tell you when your lease expires or when you have an option on a lease. And this is information that there hasn't really been systems to manage before. So there's a huge movement of not only standardizing data across the industry, but just figuring out your own company's data and how to use your own data to make better business decisions. So Simon, you spend a lot of time thinking about real estate. Can you give us a view on the technologies that you think may have the biggest impact on the industry? I know it's a big question, but if you have a view on that.
Well, just first, I think just to reinforce what you just said about on the commercial side, because I think that's where the big residential's been a lot further ahead of the curve sort of on this. And you and I in particular, I mean, a lot of the firms that have managed to work towards standardization of data, that's their business model. And that's going to be a big challenge moving forward, is that's where some of those companies who have managed to get investors to provide sort of similar data, but that's what their entire business is based on. So I think that's going to be a challenge. I think it's more of a medium-term one. I think where I suppose as the academic in the room, I'm sort of entitled to take the sort of the big picture, long-term sort of perspective. The thing that I think excites me looking sort of further out is where things like blockchain can go. And I think that, real estate, whether it's with an individual household with their family home or whether it's a major investor with a shopping mall, the big issues are it's a big expensive asset and it's illiquid. And I think that's the big opportunities. It is more of a longer term sort of vision, but sort of that combination of sort of fintech, blockchain, if those sort of issues, that can totally change how we invest in real estate, how we finance real estate. That, an institution is no longer looking at spending $400 million on one property. And all sort of the complications and sort of consequences, in terms of how you invest in the asset that sort of go along with that. And I think that's kind of more sort of, it is more of the medium to longer term sort of view though. Yeah.
All right, so let's move a little bit into more of the built environment or the construction industry. Drew, do you have a view on how technology might change how buildings are operated and managed?
I mean, I think most of my background is more residential than construction, but I think on the construction side of the industry, in the commercial space, one of the interesting areas is certainly modular to me. And I think, like I just actually saw, I can't really share the name of the company because it's stealth, but like in Brooklyn last week, I kind of saw someone that's working on a next generation modular plate. And they've got huge kind of demos, and it's like in a retail warehouse. So it was super cool to actually see that kind of in the flesh. I hear about it all the time and talk to people who are doing that sort of thing, but I've never actually seen those with my own eyes, so that was cool. And I think on the like landlord, I mean, I think of landlord tech as both, I mean, there's commercial landlords and residential landlords, and certainly on the residential side, there's kind of what I see as a massive land grab happening with landlord tech and kind of property management software, as more and more people put their properties online and kind of digitize. Many of these people are doing it in spreadsheets, right? Same on the commercial side, and like there's solutions that are starting to kind of digitize that whole process and kind of let the whole service operate in one go. So I think that's happening on both sides.
So you guys are more from the AEC industry than necessarily kind of real estate. Do you all have any specific questions in terms of real estate technology?
Who are some of these companies that you feel are players in landlord, resident, management stuff?
I mean, the Avail is one of them. Cozy has been around for quite a while. Cozy actually just got purchased last year by CoStar, I believe. So they're no longer independent, but they're still doing really well from what I can tell. There's, I mean, Turbo Tenant is another one. I mean, honestly, there's tons of these things that are, many of them are regional. So a lot of founders start in their own market and just go with their build customers in one city. So I don't necessarily even know. I mean, Avail has about 100,000 landlords, to give you some sense. I want to say, I think Cozy is bigger than that. And trying to think, Rentec Direct is probably 15,000-ish. So I don't know, it gives you some sense. Like the bigger ones are probably in the hundreds of thousands of customers. I'm not sure anyone is, there's probably one that, I don't know, I'm trying to think if there would be someone over 500,000 or a million customers, but my guess is probably not.
So are you guys dealing with those, getting to that level with standardization?
So the data dictionary is sort of an ever-expanding thing. So I think, as Simon said, residential, even though there are some things we've got some inefficiencies in, it's sort of still out front technology-wise as compared to commercial or really property management. That was sort of a space that none of the big tech money went into property management for a long time. So any of the data sets, we initially focused just on the transaction because that was the problem that needed to be solved at the multiple listing service. But it can go much further than that now. You can get into, again, about whether it's about customers, whether it's about the property itself. There's not, or at least there wasn't, a truly unique identifier for properties across the country. You had APN numbers for your parcels that might match up across different marketplaces or be duplicates. And you have multiple listings in different MLSs for the same home because of the way the organizations overlap. And records would look like this home has been sold 3 times in a year. So we've got unique property identifiers now where you can take the country code and the sub-country code and the APN and an additional identifier, and when you create a standard for that, you can identify a building on the property, even if it's not its own parcel. And when people all start using that data, now you can build more intelligence into any of your systems. What's actually being rented, what's being sold, what's being built that's working well. And so as we hit more of those ways to really have better data and just get available data to anyone who may use it in construction or engineering, or maybe it's just retail or sales, you've just got much better data sets and more intelligent in the decision making.
There's also a huge movement on the multifamily and office side in terms of using technology to manage anywhere from bringing tenants in to managing the tenant experience. Colliers just launched Neighborhood by Colliers, I think, which is a series of offerings to bring into a building to offer, amenities to tenants, or building systems controls, so being more energy efficient, or managing online contracts. And there's numerous companies, and none of them are going after the whole thing, right? You have some of the largest contractors on the data side, Yardi, MRI, and others that manage data for properties, and then they're starting to buy some of these companies that are focusing, hey, let's just focus on figuring out what's the right rental price. There's a company called YieldStar that tells you, okay, this is where your property's leased right now. you didn't have any tours, we're going to drop rents, and then we're going to bring rents up tomorrow. And so more using data to make decisions, and you have numerous tech companies being set up to focus on very small pieces of property management. And ultimately, I think there will be a lot of consolidation in that space.
I have a question, but more than a question is sharing my experience of why I stopped working with real estate agents. I'm a commercial drone pilot, and the low-hanging fruit for when you're fresh out of being certified is going to take aerial pictures and videos for real estate for developers to showcase the houses and all that, right? There is much more though to that. Like there are GIS applications. You can have permanent installation record stuff. You can even do MOS analysis. You can do isolation analysis through thermal photography and that. There are many applications. And I stopped working with realtors because most of the time I got the shut door in my face, and they were saying, no thanks, I'm a drone pilot myself, or I do have a drone pilot, or oh yeah, what's his name, or whatever, and I actually saw pictures, well, that is fine. Until I actually go to the pilot registry and they're not certified. And that's actually a federal offense. It's something that most realtors don't know, and they tell me, yes, of course I'm certified. They never show me their ID or whatever. And obviously I never actually told them anyone. They can totally, the FAA, then especially, I will report only in the case that there's some severe risk going on, and I believe one of the members of one community that I'm a member of was showcasing this picture that a realtor took with a drone, and the intention of the realtor was to be descriptive on how near an airport was to this house that he was selling. And he actually took a picture exactly about the runway. It's that most have been recorded right away.
That's wrong. I'm a realtor and not a pilot.
Right.
Oh, I see drone pilots for real estate agents flying in places that are no fly.
So, yeah.
It was about 500 feet exactly over the runway, totally out of the pattern.
Okay, so it's not like over the runway.
You sure it wasn't like keyhole data or something?
It was about the runway, like 3/4 of the runway, so there's no, it wasn't an error.
So I can address that. As a realtor member, I'm on their board of directors. There are 1.3 million realtors. And just like we see bad headlines about doctors and lawyers, there are some realtors who don't follow the rules. They're almost all independent contractors. You're absolutely right. There are people who do that, and they should have a license to do it. I understand the frustrations there. There are also some fantastic people who do it right, but that is an issue. And honestly, we've had media about that constantly over the last few years, as everybody thinks they can fly their own drones, and some folks listen, some folks don't. It's an issue. It's definitely worthy of more publications to realtors who they should realize what the rules are there.
And
Sure.
please understand that my intention is not to heckle or whatever. It's really that I feel I'm for the first time in front of people who can help me start a conversation on that, and either get these people regular or educate them, or even offer my own services to get back to the real estate on the table, which I'm happy to. But what I'm trying to do is a little bit of evangelization, but more specifically the rules that the FAA has set for precisely avoiding those kinds of...
Yeah, and I think it'll be an educational process, right? People need to understand what the rules are. As we think about drone technology and construction, there are some very interesting companies in the tech space that have been using drones to monitor construction sites, and have really applied the technology in an interesting way. I don't know if any of you are familiar or could speak more to what they're doing in that space, but using drone technology to be able to extrapolate data on where we are on the schedule versus where we think we should be. And that's really a tool that's helpful for owners who, you know, aren't into the day-to-day of necessarily of the construction company of really what's happening. And that's been
I found them to be a little bit more because they're more in an engineering-like discipline that it's kind of more match with what I do.
Yeah, it's a great application of the technology. Do we have other questions?
So we talked about real estate trends, but so far it's been fairly traditional. And with the upcoming generations, millennials, Gen Z, there are indications that there's that's changing of like the idea around home ownership and things like that. So things like housing as a service or as cooperative ownership. Curious if anyone has any thoughts in regards to that.
Simon,
Who's got a good one on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually literally right now I'm writing an article on this, on the whole co-living movement. And that, I mean, fractional is part of that, but there's also, there's kind of a couple different categories to me of that. There's
What was part of that?
co-living and fractional home ownership is part of co-living, and I think that's going to become increasing in trend and start to drive that co-living movement a little faster. Because if you don't own it, like, you're not as incentivized to kind of make that work, right? Versus now you go join a commune and you pay rent, and like there's eight other people in the house, but you're not necessarily building any long-term equity the way that if the building was run as a kind of blockchain-based solution, that everyone kind of every month X% of your rent goes automatically into building equity, and then like in 3 years you own 2.5% of that building and get kind of part of the return going forward. So I think that's like, I don't think that's happening yet, but I see I think that sort of thing will start to happen more and more.
It's not happening here, but it's big in the rest of the world.
Yeah, there's some specific securities laws issues that make it difficult in the environment here. But there are many companies working on this, and digital ownership of assets is a very key part of that, making them more liquid. But you have accredited investor tests, which is why it doesn't work that well now.
Yeah. I think we had a question back there.
Well, one thing that's really refreshing to hear so much about residential. I was part of the National Institute of Building Sciences a number of years ago, and everybody talks about AEC, and the slide that Mike had in the earlier presentation said 10 to 15% of our GDP. That all comes off of real wage statistics. Nobody knew before. Everybody assumed at NIBS that was commercial, and nobody really understood. And I finally had NHB economists break it down, and you go to their website now, 50% of that number is residential. Yet, I'm really excited to hear that we have a focus on that, because that's a huge number. But that being said, the data dictionary you speak of, is that the same data dictionary that Building Smart International has been involved with a number of years with Rita Foster and all that? Or are you guys totally independent from Building Smart International data dictionary and whatever you're doing?
So we're an independent organization, but we work with other standards organizations. So wherever we can make those match up, MISMO in the mortgage industry has some fields and things where we have worked together to make sure that we can match up those kind of fields. So I'm not positive. I'll tell you, I'm my first month on the job, so you give me a good question about that as well, and I can look into it. But we work with a lot of other standards organizations on that. The goal is not to create this repository that only we know about. It's about making it useful for anybody who wants to use it. As long as they're also contributing to the growth of the data dictionary. And that could be any other space. It could move into commercial and into property management, and it is in some ways already, because you've got resources that are not just properties, but they're actors within that space as well.
One other question I have for the panel, I guess I wanted to pose is, I think one of the challenges, blockchain was introduced on FinTech at Elkanak a few years ago in Finland, and it is looked at as being used here in the industry. Not just for financial transactions, but even fingerprints of functional aspects of maintenance and everything else. One of the challenges that I see, and I'm wondering what you guys are seeing this as a challenge or not, and if so, how do we get out of it? In this built environment industry, there is a tremendous amount of money being made on obfuscation, chaos, and misinformation, and to the degree that many of these silos, if they're not silos anymore, they will cease to exist and be profit centers because the profit's being made off that. What do you, and we're watching some of these other transparent things, we're seeing that break down. How do you see that? Is it a huge impact? And how are we going to get past that? Because we have that resistance, I feel. Maybe we don't. I want to hear what you guys think in the industry as part of what's keeping us held back from getting these changes accomplished.
I think there is. I think there's huge. I mean, it's like we were saying earlier. I mean, there are a lot of the data providers in real estate. They make their money because of the lack of transparency. And it's part of it. I think this is going to be the square. This kind of, the circle is going to have to be squared sort of on this. Is, the people who have the data will give the data to those companies because it is going to be kept confidential, because they're guaranteeing a lack of transparency. So how do you, and I mean, Molly will tell you, I mean, it's like, a lot of investors would not provide data if you can identify them as investors, never mind individual properties. And this is where the residential and the commercial really differ. So I think it is going to be a huge challenge that's going to have to be sort of got around, sort of there.
Yeah, I mean, the issue starts with just why these massive companies set up single-member LLCs with all these weird names, right? Because they don't want you to know who they are. And then it pervades the industry into you don't want to know where you're signing tenants or who you're signing as tenants and when and what concessions you're giving. And in building, I mean, I think until there's a group that comes out and is fully transparent and can be competitive on pricing and say, this is what it costs, and there are some that do this, this is what it costs us, this is the margin I'm going to take, and this is what I'm going to sell it to you, and they open up their books, and more folks start doing that. Until you have to do that to earn business, I don't think that transparency will change. And so there may be owners that are going to require that of certain companies, but there are new folks making big moves in the construction space that will be building and are being open about their margins and their materials costs. And if they do that, that could change the industry if you can force the others to have to do that, but that'll put a lot of people out of business.
I'd like to comment, please. And I think what you're saying is fantastic, and it's great to see this end of the industry, your end of the industry, sort of coming together like this to speak, because if you look at the other end of the industry, the planning industry, the government end, it's like an industry that's having a cardiac arrest. It's terrible. And it's basically a reverse heart attack, that you're all rushing to get everything going, but they've actually killed it before you start. And one of those problems is the data, because you don't have a city or a county that is replicated by the next city or county. So all the data is stuck before you actually start. You've got to get a cohesive system going, so you need to bring government into play with you to get that work. And that needs to come from the education process to start with, and from your process, to start to get a seamless system, because it doesn't matter how much you improve the speed that you're in, it takes you, the cost of getting the development going in this region, in this state, compared to Australia, is 5 times. Because you're actually waiting for 2 years to get a permit. Sometimes I know one family have waited for 20 years for a permit. Now, put a cost against that. And this is where you have to fix it. You've got to get some rationale. And it's got to come from people like you to start to say to government, let's work together.
We're relying on you guys.
There is for any of you that are interested, that ICC started that. It was called AutoCode a number of years ago. They lost funding, and it was taken over by Tech out of the University of Texas, Austin. And the Smart Codes project, there was a demonstration given on this, 60 days to 60 seconds, on plans submittal through 6 municipalities throughout the U.S., having it completely digitally managed. Now, I haven't looked recently to see why this hasn't gone further, but that work is being done. So if anybody's interested, I would suggest seek them out and push it.
Smart codes?
Yeah, out of Tech. They just renamed, or they just merged with Construction Industry Organization. I can't remember the name. If you look up University of Texas, Austin, Tech.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the mindset of some of the municipalities and governments is just not there. I was on the phone with a very large city in the U.S. deputy mayor this week, and we showed them a list of properties that they own, and they got really upset because they wanted to know where we got it, right? And so when that's the mindset, I mean, it depends on the jurisdiction, obviously, but that's a very massive undertaking.
Just one thing on that as well. I think that's where it's interesting because the industry is changing so fast with the iBuyers and fractional ownership and everything else. We're seeing everyone challenge the traditional concepts. So the ideas of how a multiple listing service has been set up is changing a lot. We just read a fascinating piece from a friend of ours, Rob Hahn, about the idea of maybe there's a marketplace where, based on a distributed ledger that's open, that anybody can bring property data and listing data, and obviously you need governance for, who's allowed to input and edit, but if it's got a historical source of truth there that everyone can look to, maybe that's how you end up when you do have those barriers, whether it's governmental or the moat monsters who profit from lack of efficiencies, that you can go around those if necessary. And whether or not you have to go that far, but they see this concept as possible, that's where you get people to move. And when they can see that the industry or the people working in it are going to go through or around, then you have more people willing to listen to the conversation.
There's a micro example of this in the multifamily space in a company called Commercial Analytics here in Seattle. They just launched a couple months ago and basically got multifamily owners to contribute their data into a database about their apartment rents and vacancies and concessions. And then they scrub that data, anonymize it, and republish it out. And then people pay, a nominal fee. I think it's $700 or $800, maybe $1,000 a year for access. But anyone that contributes their data is able to benefit from the group. And I think there were there must have been close to 700 properties that willingly contributed their data to this database to be able to have better data in return on rents and operating metrics of multifamily. So there's a possibility that a private provider can come in, at least on the property data side, for transparency and bring some transparency to companies that are willing to trust a source to anonymize data, right? Because that's the important thing. You've got to make sure that someone doesn't know a specific building what rents and concessions and everything are, or what a specific owner is doing with an asset. But that's kind of a micro example of the potential for data sharing in real estate in the future.
Commercial analytics, you said?
Commercial analytics.
And you still have the issue then, which goes back to the standards. So it's still the ensuring, even if they're prepared to share, are they comparable? Is the data everybody's providing, equivalent?
Yeah, or is it just another observation kind of feature? Make it more difficult.
So I don't think there's any doubt about the value of data and tech, great things it can do. But we've also seen some big tech getting some trouble recently, over different things, abuses, oversight, Where do you see this going? Do you think in general, most industries, whether it's real estate, are going to be able to kind of solve and marshal this themselves, or do you think the government's going to get involved again and just help slow innovation because of their regulatory approach? I think back to my wife and I are from a very predominantly Caucasian part of the country. When we first moved across the country, you want to see a realtor get nervous, ask about the ethnic makeup of a neighborhood. They're like, whoa, we can't answer that. We want a diverse neighborhood. But because that data can be used negatively or positively, we couldn't use it for a positive purpose. So I'm really always concerned when the government gets involved. But, it's getting to the point where it seems like somebody needs to do something because some of the companies have taken liberties that they shouldn't have. There's always some, maybe the best of intentions, but things start to sway.
And yeah, absolutely. We're seeing that. It's a top level priority for multiple listing services that have customer information and consumer information there. And really any brokerage company as well. You see the regulations happening in Europe, and how long should we be holding on to customer data, and how much should we know about customers, and even if we can track them and keep these analytics and sort of anonymize and figure out the ROI of our tools because we know what they're using and how much they're using it. Do we trust the person who's anonymizing it? Have they really, gotten that information secured in a way that we're not going to have government scrutiny because of it? And I think, being realistic, the government is going to be a lot more involved. I think that it seems inevitable from the direction we're heading. Clearly, you're not excited about that, and none of us want more regulation. But in the absence of the industry getting out in front of something like that really actively, the government will fill that gap.
You see the industries getting in front of that?
They are. They absolutely are. But when different parts of the country are, already passing their own regulations, in California, they could massively change the way multiple listing services work right now. Can we even save data about a seller from 5 years ago in a listing? Probably, but we're not sure. We need legal interpretations on that sort of thing. So those questions are being asked. There are leadership getting out in front of those things, but there's not a lot of clarity yet.
In Europe as well, I mean, just on the commercial side, I mean, slightly ahead of sort of here, but like retail investors have been using sort of mobile technology to track customers in the shopping mall. And so some of the issues that have come up with sort of social media here, similar issues have been sort of questioned about sort of, can shopping centre sort of managers, how that data is kept, how it's stored, how it's used, what data is being sort of, obtained. But that's sort of, so some of this, a lot of the same issues we've seen with social media are already sort of rearing their head in a real estate context in Europe.
There's always a rush to build tech, thinking of all the great things, and sometimes I think we think about the bad things that could happen.
You think about some of the simplest things like nanny cams with people walking through listings. Do they know that they're actually on? We have situations where sellers listen to the buyers and what they say as they walk through the home. Not only are we worried about fair housing here, because they're seeing what the buyers look like and what kind of decisions are they making because of that. But if the wife says she doesn't like the kitchen and it's ugly, the seller might not like that person and not sell the home to them. Now that's their choice if it's simply because of that. But did the buyers know? Did they know, and did the agent know that they're being watched? We've got a lot more access to digital information about people than we had before.
Thanks for taking the time to give us a real estate perspective. A lot of times from the AEC side, we don't often get to hear that perspective. So if you guys were able to sit on a soapbox for a second and say, what can that sector do in order to make it more cohesive with the real estate sector, or because basically we have the two panels here. We got the real estate panel, and then we got the construction panel right after this. How do we bridge that gap to make it easier for your sector? You brought up transparency, and I think that's one thing. And is there other things, or other tools, other things that when you are dealing with AEC that says this would be so much more simple for us if we were able to?
I think transparency in data is a huge piece, right? How much do things cost to build? How long is it going to take? What are the materials? What's the materials cost? What's the markup? What's your margin? If you look at the stats on rework on construction today, it's staggering, right? The amount of construction costs that go into rework. So I think it's two factors. I guess one, transparency and opening up, more data to be accessible to the folks that have the capital that are financing the project, so they understand, who's getting compensated for what and why. One, and then two, how do we find ways to build more efficiently and try to reduce those costs so that we can do things like build affordable housing, right? At this point, if you look at the city in terms of building affordable housing, it's not happening because it's too expensive. The per square foot building costs right now, not to mention issues with getting permits and how long that takes, but just building costs alone are too high to be able to, from a private sector perspective, provide housing to the essential workers in our community. And so, ideally, we can find ways to do things cheaper and maintain quality. But I know that's a massive undertaking, obviously, and there are people that are taking a run at it. So,
kind of piggybacking on your question a little bit, what do you think about roboticized construction and the trends going on in that industry? One, what is going on in that industry? And two, how's it affecting square foot building costs? Three, how's that going to impact long-term real estate trends and building design and things like that?
I think it's fantastic. I think it's exciting. Those are the news stories that get practitioners excited when they get their newsletter every morning to see someone 3D printing a home. And I think we're starting to see that kind of efficiency where it might not be to the complex level that we'd expect in certain kinds of homes, but whether it's workforce housing, whether it's housing in countries that are underdeveloped, there's a lot of the very simple construction, and then the robotics. There's no limit, obviously, to the level of complexity that you can integrate there. Now, you all know how much of that's smoke and mirrors, and how much is just me watching a video. So the folks in the construction side can obviously tell us how far it's actually come, but it's obviously the path forward in terms of efficiency in a lot of ways.
Do you see that working financially? I mean, I've seen some of those videos. I've background CNC machining, and I bought the 2x4 at Home Depot. I could make a rocking chair out of for a couple of bucks. That's what most people are building. To do that precision with robotics and CNC machinery, you're talking an engineered number. I'm talking $10 plus in 2x4. Contera's doing some great things. I don't think that they're necessarily profitable yet. And when I think back, the only thing that's changed is the technology. I grew up in a home that was built in the 70s, prefabricated. Over-top container trucks, traded it in place, 2-story home went up in a day. We did that in the 70s. So the technology's there, but we're still not seeing the finances yet. I think it's still kind of R&D. I don't know if you guys agree with that or.
Yeah, I mean, part of that's just, I think, sheer cost of land, right? And if you trace the incentives, I mean, a lot of the reason this stuff's not happening kind of in Seattle or in these places is because your opportunity cost is too high to do something else with the land. So I think like Icon doing their houses, it's much more interesting to me in an international context than it is here in the States. Just because of there is no regulation in a bunch of these in the third world, right? So they can kind of do something brand new and do it and rather than spend 2 years fighting regulation to you let me put this freaking building in Seattle.
Yeah, and I think you really have to get to scale, right? You have to be doing this over and over and over again to get that cost efficiency. There is a ton of money that goes into R&D, but you have a lot of companies in other countries that are able to do it much more efficiently than we can here. And so hopefully as more and more people are putting capital into that, more and more being spent in R&D, there will be efficiencies as those products are purchased more and manufactured more, and the supply chain is better controlled.
Good question.
It's definitely happening now. It's happening more in the Bay Area. Google's jumped full in with it, with Factory OS and things. It's manufacturing and AEC mixed together. So the only way to get the cost down of the buildings is to be more efficient and use the material smarter. And so that has to happen. It's custom build every time on a site. Just it's unsustainable.
I want a unique building with Sean.
Well, we can make it, we can paint it.
One of the things I work with Sam in the industry, one of the challenges is the efficiency or the affordability words are connected. We have 300,000 empty bedrooms in the Seattle marketplace. And data and some of your fantastic minds on the sites where the highest and best use of those existing properties or with new underlying zoning, and I know City Builders has moved into that space a little bit, having for the land control owner or potential investors, having that best case scenario for maximizing to fill some of these voids we need for this middle housing. I perceive, and maybe there's some companies, Ryan, you found, that are actually working in that space, but I don't see it yet, and we really need that.
Yeah, Troy and I have some common grievances about the lack of affordability, but mostly due to the lack of just the volume of available homes in our area. And I know you've all seen the affordability issues that we had locally. We've worked on a lot of legislative policy on that, on getting good data to the decision makers, because a lot of times what they have doesn't actually represent what's out there. They think we've got this much buildable space available, but some of it is impeded by what's on the property, what's next to the property. It's not attractive, and you've got to go through multiple agencies at the state level to say, well, this is the year that you're creating the study, and this is the year you're going to Office of Financial Management for them to analyze it, and they've got to go through one of the regional authorities to get funds for transportation that are tied to whether or not they're actually keeping up with the growth in the Growth Management Act, and the growth they're supposed to have in the volume of building units in their local cities. I mean, it's a mess. It's very complex. It's getting better. We've had some significant changes lately. But if they don't have access to good data, they can't make those kind of decisions. And we were looking at one point where we were adding 70,000 people a year in King County, and we were only building 10,000 units. I mean, it's clearly unsustainable. But that kind of data, which was clear to anyone using just public data and figuring it out by using driver's licenses or something simple like that, that's not the kind of reports that were being created for the government agencies. So the decisions they were making were based on just poor data.
You're talking about that. Now, I think everybody understands that quality of the decision is based on the quality of the information you have. But people are not, in average, they're not equipped to analyze that data. And the reason I'm telling you this, because I studied psychology, that's my first degree. Then I studied business with IT minor, worked for a lot of companies, including 7 years in construction management. Before I got into real estate, I got classes in everything, residential, commercial, client comes to me, I have to walk through about their own decision making because people don't understand the data. Even if they do the tech, I think we are in a world when we think that we see the data, then we know what we're looking at what we don't. So when you have a consultation on that, 9 out of 10 times my clients end up buying something entirely different or investing differently because they learn about it in the process. Commercial or residential. Even in commercial, I'm like, do you understand your employees and what's important to them? And with residential, it's the most important financial decision for so many people's lives. You got to buy one house, and then your entire family's financial future is on that. It's an investment, so who cares what the data says yesterday, what things are sold for? What does it going to value 10, 20 years from now? So we are not really helping the human factor. The technology is great. I mean, yay for supporting us, but it's not substituting caring for the people or give them the education of how to use the data. So what are we automating on that? What are we going to do?
I mean, I think one thing that I've seen over the kind of past 10 years or so is, I mean, consumers used to contact a professional because there was no data. Like you had to talk to a realtor to get any information on any houses right? And then now there's all this flood of data that's everywhere. And now it's all kind of the flip side of now you're contacting realtors so that they can help you decipher that and like tell you what the hell all this like thousands of lines of data mean, right? Because consumers have no freaking idea, right? But I think that's a landscape shift that's going to continue to play out in a bunch of industries, right? Same thing as travel is very similar to real estate in that regard.
But that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that like people are agents putting clients on a long way that that's like that never happens to my client. You're not going to get like, oh, look, you get a notification, something come up because I look at that data and I'm like, I'm from construction, I'm like, that is just a stupid form, like, ew. So, like certain things are like, and then you overlay with where the commercial zone and whatever, like the transportation zone. So I still think we have so much work when it comes to the human advisory factor and decision making for people, because for me that's the missing link here, right?
Just from sort of an education perspective, and that's one of the debates we've been having at the Dub, because how do we incorporate technology, things like data analytics into the curriculum for students? Now, my personal view is we shouldn't be focusing that much on the technological side because the university has phenomenal programs that do that, but it is more the interpretation of the data. The students we're sending out there aren't going to be doing, the technological aspects of it. They're going to be the ones being asked to interpret it. And it's a totally different type of data than what real estate people have been used to dealing with and addressing in the past. And but that's my view. There are others that would disagree with that. But I totally agree. I think it's, you see it, and I think people underestimate this with commercial. People get with residential, it's a very emotive decision. It's buying a home. Commercial investment, you can have just as much of an emotive sort of decision. It's it's really weird. It's like sort of, sort of the background I've had sort of teaching sort of finance sort of students and real estate students, you sort of see the difference. Even as coming in as students, people who come into real estate do tend to bring sort of a bit more emotion to their decision making. You see it even in the classroom. And they also tend to be far more risk averse, which I always find really interesting compared to sort of, finance students in a business school. But it's that emotion is sort of a huge element.
So I think we have time for maybe one more. Go ahead.
So I've seen like two really interesting trends. Like you hear everyone's moving to the city, we're building up and up. You also see like technological trends, where like self-driving cars or now like web conferencing solutions, allowing people to move further and further out of cities. Where, from your vantage point, in terms of where people are building office space, residential homes, like do you see people kind of contracting for the city or further expanding out from our cities now that we're more technologically advanced?
You see trends in terms of office and multifamily or living space being more service oriented, right? So I think people are wanting to be near services. So want a meal delivered. I want to be close to the gym. I want to be close to, a studio. I want to be in a vibrant community. And so from that, you see people moving to cities. But the affordability issue, I think, also pushes people out. And the fact that there are technologies that allow people to connect also facilitate folks living further out. So I think there are kind of dynamics on both sides, but you do see movement and trends of many people moving into more community-oriented, shopping, living, services areas than you had in the past.
I think I just sort of add sort of on that. I think, you talk to any sort of corporate real estate person, I think sort of the biggest real estate issue they have is actually, particularly in this town, is affordability, for their workforce. So you're having sort of people, and it's a generational sort of issue. So the demographics and how those the generational sort of shifts. So yes, you had movements downtown, you had movements towards sort of the city. But there's some, I think it was Zillow did this a couple of years ago. They did some really nice research that showed that what you got to remember, particularly about the younger millennials and Generation Z, they as children observed the financial crisis, and actually in many respects they are quite conservative when it comes to real estate. So actually they have far more in common. It was really interesting sort of piece that Zillow did, that they have more in common with their grandparents' generation than their parents' generation, because they saw the impact of the financial crisis of a decade ago. So actually, just because millennials have moved to the city, it doesn't mean that when they have families they want to go to stay there. Actually, the suspicion is that they will still want to move out to the suburbs, and actually, so you could see that sort of swing back as that generation sort of matures, if you like.
You even see that trend.
I'm from Square, Washington. That's about as far that way as you can go. I'm a general contractor, and a lot of people are moving. There's a lot of building out there, and my customers are doing their work online, and it's so easy to commute now from here to Cambridge to Seattle. When they want to go to a fair or Seattle Center, they just get in their car, someday self-driving car, and they come over. There's a lot of building going on out there, and there's really no fun infrastructure like you'd find down in Seattle. So yeah, there's a lot of people. They'll buy a place there and have a little place here and finish their careers and then move completely.
I think one interesting thought to think about on that topic is the self-driving in the context of motorhomes. I think that would be an interesting. I mean, my dad is a motorhome and he lives like half the year in Arizona, but like once self-driving comes into play, I can imagine that dynamic around basically just moving your whole bedroom with you wherever you go being a lot more accessible to the normal population. Not like the normal population, but a lot of people don't want to, like the act of driving a huge motorhome is like, most people don't want to do that, right?
Yeah, you even see it in the brokerage business though, is some of the biggest trends are real estate brokerage companies owning little or no actual real estate. and they're really, really expansive companies who all of their agents work virtually. I mean, you see it in a lot of industries where you've got folks doing remote work. So it's going to affect, obviously, traffic patterns and design. And we hear about cities doing long-term planning around where will we be with driverless cars, and does that actually put fewer cars on the street, or does it end up putting more cars on the street? Really interesting questions, and I think we just probably really don't know at this point, but it's fun to talk about.